Today, we're going to walk through the Descope Agentic Identity Hub, a centralized control plane for managing identity, access, and authorization for AI agents. We'll start with clients, the foundational credential primitive that every agent authenticates as. Then move into how identities are formed at runtime, how you can define what agents can access, how you secure connections to external systems, and finally, how policies and observability tie everything together. We'll start with clients, the foundational primitive of the Agentic Identity Hub. Every agent that authenticates with Descope does so as a client. A client has a set of allowed grant types, a name, a description, and a tag. Every single client in Descope also retains its own client ID and secret that is used by the agent to prove its identity. Everything else in the hub, from the agentic identities themselves, to policies, to connections, builds on top of this. When you build a client, you give a name, a description, and configure how it's allowed to authenticate. These are also known as the grant types. Authorization code is for agents acting on behalf of a user, where explicit user consent is required. Client credentials is for autonomous agents, where there is no user involved and the agent authenticates directly with its own credentials that you receive when you create the client. JOT-bearer is for agents arriving with a JOT already from an upstream workload identity system like AWS IRSA or an already used external auth provider. Descope validates that OIDC token and issues one of its own. And finally, SIBA supports headless back-channel flows where user authorization can happen out of band of the traditional agentic cycle. Once created, the client gets a client ID and, depending on the grant type, a client secret or public key configuration. These are the credentials that your agent presents when requesting a token from Descope. Now, if we go back to the main clients page, you can see there are many different types of clients here. Some are labeled Claude, some are labeled Visual Studio Code, and this is because clients can also be registered dynamically through MCP servers using Dynamic Client Registration, or CIMD. This is useful when you want your agents to self-register rather than being pre-provisioned. Now that we understand what a client is, let's look at agentic identities, the complete directory of every agentic identity in your system. The first type you can see here is a user-delegated agent. These are created when a user goes through authorization code flow and grants consent to a specific client. You can see the specific client is shown here, along with the agent type, in this case user-delegated, the registration method, in this case dynamic client registration through an MCP server, and the owner being the agent itself since it's self-registered with DCR. If the client had been pre-provisioned through the Descope console or through a management API, the respective owner would show here, along with the associated user, and most importantly, the consent. The consent is the scopes that the user has consented the agent to have, in other words, the permissions within the MCP server, and what those permissions entitle them to. In this case, Google Calendar tokens, HubSpot scopes for both read and write, etc. Each user-client consent pair becomes its own distinct agentic identity in this directory. Now, the second type of agentic identity in this system is autonomous agents. When you create a client that is configured with client credentials, it appears here automatically as an agentic identity. The identity is one-to-one with the client, there's no user involved, and no additional action is required for it to show up. As you can see, the agent type is autonomous agent, the registration method, in this case, is manual because I pre-provisioned the client, and the agent was provisioned in the console. The important thing to note here is that every agentic identity has its unique agent ID. This agent ID allows for you to be able to audit and understand all the behaviors, the permissions in your system. From this page, you can see exactly which clients exist, which users have delegated access to which agents, which scopes were consented to, and which resources each identity is permitted to reach. Also, if you need to revoke access, rotate credentials, or understand the blast radius of a compromised client, this is where you start. Now that we understand how agents authenticate and how their identities are formed, let's define what they can access. This starts with resources. Resources are where you register your resource servers with Descope, whether that's a standard backend API or an MCP server or any other service your agents need authorized access to. When you create a resource, you are giving Descope the context it needs to reason about that server, its identifier, otherwise known as the audience, and the scopes it exposes. That is what makes it referenceable in policies later. For each resource, you define scopes that describe a specific action or data available on that server. A CRM API, for example, might expose something like CRM contacts read and CRM contacts write. We can add these scopes here. We can add a human readable description and an audience. And as you can see, you can also map Descope roles to each of these scopes. These Descope roles can actually be synced directly with your SSO groups, or they can be used with the internal RBAC Descope system. Once you've set all of these things, go ahead and create the resource. And now the resource has been created successfully. Once saved, this resource becomes a target that you can reference in any policy. Whether it's an MCP server or a plain REST API, Descope now has everything it needs to enforce least privilege access against it. Before we move on to policies, however, it's worth mentioning this MCP server type as a resource. Now, MCP servers are a specific type of resource with significantly more built-in capabilities. When you create an MCP server in Descope, Descope acts as the full authorization server for it, with support for consent flows, dynamic client registration, CIMD, fine-grained scopes, and custom session management. You define the server's name, the description, an MCP server URL, which is effectively the same as the audience in a traditional backend API resource, as well as how your agents will be able to register dynamically. If you want to enable things like CIMD and DCR, you can do that here. You can also set a dynamic registration template, which allows you to configure the session settings and consent behavior, as well as the JOT templates for all the clients that dynamically register with this resource. You can also then define scopes, just like any other resource. However, these scopes cannot just be mapped to roles, but also mapped to downstream connection token scopes, like you were seeing in the Agentic Identities page. For example, if your MCP server is fetching from our connections vault a token for Google Calendar or HubSpot, you can ensure that the right scopes for the MCP tools or the MCP server map to the right connection scopes needed downstream. Once the MCP server is created, you can see Descope automatically generates a well-known configuration endpoint for it. You can plug that directly into your MCP implementation, whether you're using Descope with FastMCP, the Vercel MCP adapter, or you're simply rolling your own server with a protected resource metadata endpoint. Once done, Descope handles all the identity and authorization layer, and your MCP server focuses purely on tool execution. Next, we'll go to connections. Connections are effectively your secure token vault for agents and MCP servers. This is where you configure external OAuth providers your agents need access to, as well as API keys for tools that don't support OAuth. These are not tokens issued by Descope, they're external credentials that Descope secures and manages on behalf of your agents. Connections can be used directly with agents or indirectly through an MCP server. In both cases, the agent authenticates with Descope, Descope enforces the policy, and then only provides access to the external token needed to invoke a specific tool. Descope understands full OAuth lifecycles, including refresh tokens and expiration, so agents can always get the correct up-to-date credential without ever handling secrets directly. This is an example of an OAuth connection where you have a client ID and secret, as well as your token stored here. And for an API key or certificate, this is what it looks like. You can also start by going to one of these templates. We have many templates here to get you started and set up with the right scopes, the OAuth providers or API key providers that you need. Now, let's tie everything together with policies. A policy is a single rule that defines exactly who can access what, under which conditions, and how. Let's walk through creating one. First, you give a policy a rule name and an optional description. be specific here, something like CRM agents, production read access. Next, you define subjects, who this rule applies to. You can target a specific client by name, which you can see here, or by ID, or you can write a condition that matches a broader set. For example, all agents of type autonomous, or that have registered with dynamic client registration, for example, or all clients that are tagged with a specific environment, all clients associated with a particular tenant, all clients that have a user associated with them that has a specific role, that kind of stuff. This is what gives you the flexibility to write one policy that covers an entire class of agents rather than maintaining rules one by one. Then you define targets, the resources or connections this policy grants access to. You can select any resource server you've registered or any connection in the vault. For each target, you can also choose which specific scopes can be issued. For example, this MCP server, you can say specifically allow calendar read, and which grant types are permitted for that specific target. You can add multiple targets to a single policy, each with their own scope and grant type configuration. One policy can govern an agent's full access surface. You could save it, and it'll be enforced immediately. Any client matching the subjects that can request a token for a listed target gets evaluated against this rule. Anything outside the defined scopes or grant types is denied. No code changes required. Finally, the Agentic Activity Dashboard is your operational command center for everything we just configured. This dashboard gives you real-time and historical visibility into how agents, MCP servers, connections, and policies are actually being used. We have our traditional audit, but we also have these dashboards that help give your descopers a quick glance at the activity. At the top, MCP server registrations are broken down by server type. Next, we have active connections by token, which credentials are currently live. Then, top policy violations by MCP server, surfacing agents attempting to access scopes they are not authorized for. And finally, policy violations by connections, helping you spot misconfigured agents or overly broad access without digging through raw logs. With the Descope Agentic Identity Hub, you get full control from end to end, runtime agent visibility, client credential management, resource server registration, MCP-based authorization, secure external connections, precise policy enforcement across any grant type, and real-time activity monitoring. It is a complete identity and access foundation, purpose-built for the agentic era.